As the convener of SCVO, I'm delighted to welcome you to this opening session, and we're delighted to have the First Minister here with us this morning. The format will be that she will present us with some opening remarks, and then we have a panel of colleagues from the sector who, together with the First Minister, will respond to your questions, your comments and your debate. So this is to be very interactive, and so I hope you'll feel that you can take part in that, because it's very important. So, and without further ado, I'd like to hand you over to our First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you all of you for being here, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed at this early hour of the morning, at the start of what I know will be an interesting and no doubt challenging couple of days. The gathering has quickly become one of the highlights on the calendar of Civic Scotland, and I know that you'll all be up for some good discussions over the course of it. So it is really great to be here. And of course, we're here today as the SCVO publish findings that give an indication, in my view not a very surprising indication, but nevertheless an important one, of how highly valued the third sector is here in Scotland, not just by government, though I want to make very clear that the third sector is highly valued by government, but it's also highly valued by the wider public in Scotland, and the SCVO's findings show widespread support for charities and high levels of public confidence. And given what we see perhaps expressed sometimes in some other parts of the UK, I think that is a very positive context in which the gathering is opening today. Of course, it's really important over the months and the years to come that that public confidence is maintained and increased. And I certainly very much welcome the fact that the fundraising review, which we've already been discussing backstage this morning, is such an important feature of this year's programme. I think it's in the best interest of everybody, the government, the third sector, and of course the wider public, that charity fundraising methods do protect rather than undermine public trust. And that's why the government looks forward to seeing the outcome of the review when it's published. We hope that any recommendations for action can be implemented quickly, though I think it's important that any recommendations do what I've just said, protect, not undermine confidence in the sector, which is, as I've already indicated, a sector that I think does have significant levels of public support in Scotland. Now, the main message I want to take the opportunity to get across in my opening remarks this morning is, at its heart, a very simple one. The third sector is, I think it always has been, and it will continue to be, a vital social partner for the Scottish Government. We share a common cause of creating a fairer and wealthier, more equal country, where people across the country have a real say and a meaningful say in the big issues that directly affect their day-to-day lives. And to give just one example of the Scottish Government's partnership with SCVO, we're working together on our Open Government Partnership Action Plan. That plan, which I know is being discussed here later on today and which will be published in the summer, sets out how the Scottish Government intends to involve people in the reform of public services and how we will seek to improve access to information and data. For example, it will include proposals on how we report on Scotland's progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. SCVO were, without a shadow of a doubt, obvious partners for us in this work, which is one of the ways, of course, in which we're seeking to bring government closer to people across Scotland. And SCVO was an obvious partner because local third sector organisations are always at the heart of any successful attempts to work with local communities. I've said previously that I want the Scottish Government that I'm privileged to lead to be open and accessible. I am passionate in the belief that we should, even now, some months, more than a year after it, take the enthusiasm and the engagement that was unleashed in the referendum campaign on both sides of that debate and use that to address the key social and economic challenges that we face today and in the future. And there's no doubt that the third sector is an essential partner as we work to achieve that. Third sector, as many of you will know from your direct experience, has of course also more recently played a significant role in our Fairer Scotland consultation. And I think that ability of the third sector to contribute meaningfully, openly, sometimes critically, is absolutely vital. And that's why one of the things I want to stress this morning, given recent developments at Westminster, is that we don't just want the third sector to help other people to contribute to the big discussions that shape our country. We want you as third sector organisations to be free to make your own views known as well. We know, and I know from experience, that you won't always agree with the Scottish Government, but actually, and this is not always easy for politicians, it's often when you don't agree with us that it's most important that you get the opportunity to make your views known and your voice heard. And that's why we've got deep concerns about the anti-advocacy clause proposed by the UK Government and the impact a clause like that would have on third sector organisations receiving UK Government funding. And I want to confirm today and stress this very strongly, that we do not intend to add this kind of clause to any Scottish Government grant letters. We value you as partners, we value you as friends. We recognise that at times that will be as critical friends, and I don't ever want to see you or the organisations you represent written off as irksome protesters. Your contribution to how we develop policy in Scotland is vital to us, and I believe strongly that your views should be sought and listened to and not silenced in any way. Now, a major reason for that, as I mentioned earlier, is the expertise that you have. You're at the heart of day-to-day efforts to create the fairer and more prosperous country that we all want to see. So whether it's the success of our social enterprise sector, where Scotland is increasingly seen as an international leader, or the efforts of tens of thousands of charities, service providers and voluntary organisations, your innovation, your commitment and your expertise make a massive difference to literally hundreds of thousands of people each and every year. And of course, your work has been especially important in recent years and will continue to be so as we have confronted the consequences of austerity. Through food banks, skills training, care provision, mutual support groups, rehabilitation projects and many, many other programmes, you provide direct support and assistance to people who need it most. The Scottish Government is investing every year at the moment more than £100 million to try to mitigate the effects of UK welfare cuts. We're also making important investments in affordable housing and childcare, which of course will make a significant impact in tackling intergenerational poverty. But we know that we can't work alone. We're dependent on our partnership with the private sector, with the wider public sector, and of course with the third sector. And one good example of that is SCVO's Community Jobs Fund. That fund has now given more than 6,000 young people an opportunity for employment that they might not otherwise have had. In its most recent evaluation, 93% of employers were positive about the programme, and the proportion of young people entering a positive destination from that programme was almost 70%. Now that's impressive in and of itself, but it's particularly impressive when we consider that many of the places on the Community Jobs programme are reserved for groups of young people who find it particularly difficult to enter the workplace. So I'm pleased to confirm today that we're going to be investing a further £6.1 million in Community Jobs Scotland to provide training for up to 700 more young people. Most of these places will be filled by people who currently find it harder to get jobs, carers, people who are leaving care, people with disabilities, people leaving military service, and people who have convictions. And I think the success of this programme and our continued commitment to it is a further example of the role that the third sector can play in promoting opportunities and also tackling the inequalities that still exist in our country. We're also considering right now how employability services will work when they are devolved to Scotland, hopefully when we get a fiscal framework agreement reached in the coming days. But as we decide and determine how we want to develop employability services here, there's no doubt in my mind that the ethos of Community Jobs Scotland could almost serve as a model for the principles we want to adopt. We want to, in everything we do, as social security and welfare and employability powers are devolved, in everything we do, we want to respect people's dignity, value the potential they have as human beings, and encourage their aspirations and ambitions. Because we know by doing that and providing the practical support that help people to fulfil their potential, that's the best way of achieving a fairer society and tackling inequality. I want to touch also briefly this morning on public services, and in particular integration of health and social care, something that I know will be of great relevance to many of you, because the third sector is a crucial part and partner in our work to transform public services. The integration of health and social care is, in my view, the biggest and probably the most important change to health and care in Scotland since the NHS was created in 1948. For integration to be a success, and it has to be a success, health and care services need to work ever more closely with the third sector, not as an add-on, but they need to work with you as equal partners in the process of transformation. Because many of the services you provide make a huge difference to people's well-being, to their health and their happiness. And that's one reason, although it's only one reason, why as part of this process of the integration of health and social care, we are committed to paying the living wage to all care workers. And we're determined to see that implemented by October of this year. Paying the living wage, in my view, is the right thing to do anyway for any group of workers in any sector of the economy. But the principles at stake in the care sector are especially important. There are 40,000 carers in the third and independent sectors at present, and each and every one of these carers is essential to the quality of life, to the dignity and to the independence of hundreds of thousands of people. So paying the living wage is just one way, but a vitally important way of demonstrating that we value their expertise, their compassion and their commitment. And that, I hope, is also an example of the fact that in everything you do as the third sector, the Scottish Government will seek to recognise the value of that work, whether it's work in influencing policy, empowering communities, providing help, support, advice, opportunities for people across the country. The strength and the value of the work that you do is recognised. We won't, as I said earlier on, always agree. I hope we will agree more often than we disagree. But of course, it is in the nature of democracy that there will be differences of opinion. I hope we can air those openly and honestly and find ways of working together. It is also inescapable right now that we live in difficult times financially. That has an impact on the work we do as government, and it has an impact on the work each and every one of you does across the country. But my commitment to you today is that we will continue to work with you, not against you, but with you to face up to these challenges, to hear and listen to and respond to your views, to support your work and involve you closely and centrally in policy delivery and implementation. I understand that the 45,000 organisations that you represent make a massive difference to the well-being of communities across Scotland. And in doing that, you're playing a major part in helping to achieve our common cause, a fairer and more prosperous country. Without the work that you do, we as government couldn't fulfil our ambitions. So thank you again for being here, for listening to me. I look forward to taking your questions, but above all else, on behalf of the government, thank you and your colleagues for all the work that you do. Thank you very much.
First Minister, thank you very much. Colleagues, as Sheila said, we're going to have an interactive panel with three distinguished speakers from the sector, as well as the First Minister. Just to introduce them, on my far right is Michelle McCrindle, who's Chief Executive of the Food Train, Paul Reddish, who's Chief Executive of Project Scotland, and Theresa Shearer, who's Chief Executive of Enable Scotland. What we're going to do just initially is let all three of them maybe reflect on the First Minister's words and give us their own thoughts on the big challenges ahead for the sector in Scotland. Michelle, maybe start with you.
Thanks very much, John, for letting me go first, and thanks to the First Minister for our kind words about the sector this morning. Many, I'm which you're sure will agree, were very welcome. Certainly around the value that the Scottish Government places on the role of volunteers and the impact they have in communities. Certainly welcome the First Minister's comments around how important it is, the role that the third sector has in the integration of health and social care in Scotland. Not everybody's lucky enough to reach old age in Scotland, but those that do are living longer. But nowadays, unfortunately, more and more older people are experiencing many more years of ill health, frailty and disability. And Scotland remains a bit of a postcode lottery around health and social care and support. A bit more potluck than person-centred all of the time. With rising rates of dementia, malnutrition and social isolation, while eligibility tightens even further. So it's a challenge in Scotland, but things are changing in the world of health and social care, and national conversations are needed amongst all of us openly about how we pay for and how we provide the care and support that we need if our older population, which hopefully is us in the future, can achieve longer, healthier lives. So I really would like us to be a country where we value older people, where we value them as volunteers, as carers, as childminders, as workers, as community leaders, as contributors to our economies nationally and locally. And in doing that, we would then place enough of value of older people that we make those later years of life the most equal and dignified as possible. So that's my challenge for the future. I hope we're all lucky enough to get to old age, and that when we do, we live to a grand old age, and that when we do get there, when it is our turn, we can say Scotland really is the best place to grow old.
Thank you, Michelle. Paul?
I'm going to go to the other extreme and talk about young people. Particularly welcome the First Minister's comments and the investments on things like Community Jobs Scotland, which I think made a massive difference to the sector, and also to open up young people's eyes to the possibilities of working in this fantastic sector. And I know that's added a lot to a lot of the organisations throughout the country that maybe haven't had the opportunity in the past to be a shop window for young people who have looked to go into other sectors. There is a lot to be proud of when we look at where we are in Scotland around things like volunteering and young people at the moment. We have the highest rates of volunteering across the UK, and underneath that, young people volunteer more than any other age group. So, we're doing a lot right, but there are some trends underneath that we're going to need to focus on and look at if we're to improve and get even better. Volunteering rates have been quite static in Scotland for about 20 years now. So it's great that we're outperforming the rest of the UK, but we're not getting to certain groups, and they're not benefiting from being involved in their communities in the way that a lot of people are. Most of the population still don't volunteer, and around 6% of the population do about 60% of the volunteering. So underneath the figures, when you look at it, there's still a lot of work to do to get people involved in communities. And there's a lot of work for us to do as a sector as well in that. We have to look at how we can create the capacity to allow us to take more volunteers and a greater diversity of volunteers as well. And how we can support people in their volunteering and not just take people in what they can give for us. We do a lot more work today than we've ever done with young people with significant challenges and barriers and going into volunteering. And one stat that I want to share with you that sticks out, of the 170 charities that we work with, only 35 of them will take young people with criminal convictions today. So though we're doing a lot in the sector around volunteering and young people and these things, there's still a lot of work to do ourselves to ensure that we're accepting to all parts of society and able to involve them in some of the great causes that we've got.
Thank you, Paul.
Okay, there's nothing more nervous than sitting next to the First Minister and your notes are in front of you and you know she can read them. So I'm going to try not to use my notes. So I wanted to talk about creating a socially just Scotland, and the First Minister's talked a lot about that today, which is great. And I wanted to take one theme today, which is the theme of work, and just make 3 points around the theme of work, 2 of which the First Minister has already made, and a third which is a personal passion, I will confess. The first one is about fair access to work, and we are committed at Enable Scotland to ensuring that fair access is particularly there for people with learning disabilities. Individuals with learning disabilities are the least likely to enter the marketplace, and given the number of adults with learning disabilities in Scotland, given that they are living longer, and given that they want to be valued members of their community and citizens in Scotland, we want to encourage as much activity and participation in the workplace. And I just want to give you one stat that puts that into perspective. So we're all here this morning at 8 o'clock for work, all delighted to be here, I'm sure. 70% of adults with a learning disability want to work in Scotland. Today, 7% of that population got up and went into paid employment. So I think in terms of creating a socially just Scotland, we have to look at all people who are, and I hate the term furthest removed from the labour market. What we mean are people who need additional support, and that support can take lots of different guises. I'm delighted with self-directed support and with a focus on personalisation and self-directedness that we have seen from this government, but actually I think there's a lot more to be done in terms of learning disability in particular. As a representative of Enable Scotland, we have almost 2,000 employees across Scotland at the moment, and I want to talk about fair wage when you're at work. We welcome the work of the Fair Work Convention. In fact, we've put a lot of submissions and evidence to it around the work we've done with frontline workers who are typically women, who are typically low paid, and who are typically furthest away from the living wage in Scotland today. At Enable Scotland, we've made a commitment over the past 4 years to work to the living wage. We've twice made it, it's twice moved, we've twice kept up with it. We welcome the announcement of £8.25. We further welcome the announcement of the additional £250 million from Mr Swinney a couple of weeks ago. Our judgment is £250 million will help fill the gap, but it won't close the gap. And so the challenge really isn't to government, but back to us as the third sector. There are 865 providers of social care in Scotland. I'm not suggesting there should be a monopoly, but surely there's some infrastructure and some transformational change in terms of how we work. Do we need 865 chief execs of social care providers in Scotland? Possibly not, and I do say that firmly with tongue in cheek, but to start the debate around what should third sector provision look like in Scotland? How do we get more of the money to the front line, less to the infrastructure that currently supports the hierarchy and bureaucracy of all organisations? I firmly believe, having had 10 years experience in private sector, 10 years experience in the third sector, we don't have lots of inefficiency in the third sector, but neither have we had transformational change over the past 2 or 3 years that would have supported self-directed support. So I think the challenge is back to us as a sector. How do we change? How do we become more effective? And how do we ensure that less fingers touch the pound before it reaches the pocket of the front line and individual citizens start to determine what social care provision looks like for them based on their choice and their control? My third point on the theme of work in creating a socially just Scotland, and it's wonderful that we're here with a female First Minister and a female Chief Exec, and Paul was wonderful, but he is a man. So we did discuss this at dinner last night, and one of the things that has slipped off the agenda slightly from my perspective is around equality when it comes to gender, and it's right equalities across all areas of society. I am delighted that Scotland is far ahead of the rest of the UK in terms of the gender pay gap. The gender pay gap across the UK is currently 20%. In Scotland, it's 15%. I'm not delighted at having to tell my daughter that it will take another 50 years before she will potentially earn the same as her 2 younger brothers. My daughter's 9. We're looking at the figures, we're looking at the trajectory, and I think the question is, how do we get more equality across gender pay in Scotland? And how do we encourage great women who have great contributions to make to get more involved in work in Scotland and in influencing what happens at a senior level? I welcome the 50-50 agenda, but I'm disappointed that we still only have today, in 2016, 36% of women on public boards in Scotland. So, in summary, I welcome the remarks from the First Minister. We're delighted about the support the third sector and particularly social care provision has been given by this administration. But I would set the challenge to all of us is in creating a socially just Scotland, we have to, one, have fair access to work for all citizens, including people with learning disabilities. We have to ensure fair work, and the living wage is the start of that fair work. It isn't the end point, and I think we shouldn't lose sight of that. And third, a plea for all of us, male and female, to ensure that the gender equality issue stays on the map until such points we're sitting here saying our children will learn the same despite their sex, despite their gender. Thank you.
Teresa, thank you very much for all your comments. Colleagues, some interesting thoughts from the First Minister, some challenges from her as well, and actually challenges from all our speakers. So the floor is now open to yourselves for the next kind of half an hour or so. I'll maybe take a couple of questions at a time. If you say your name and your organisation, try and be short and sharp, or I will interrupt you if you're being too long. So who would like to start? Gentleman over here. Is it? Might just... Yeah, it should be.
Morning, Richard Mead from Marie Curie. At Marie Curie, we recently completed a pilot service in one NHS board which saw reduced A&E admissions, reduced hospital stays, and 80% of the patients using that project dying at home where they wanted to be compared to the normal of 29%. Supporting, obviously, Scottish Government aims in shifting care from the acute to the community, and particularly supporting the new strategic framework for action on palliative and end-of-life care that was published in just December. Following the completion of that pilot, that particular NHS board has decided not to fund the service going forward. I don't doubt the Scottish Government's commitment to the third sector, but I am genuinely worried that the third sector may be squeezed out in the integration process, but by the statutory partners, particularly as funding is tight and we need brave decisions like this one. What does the panel think that the third sector can do to make ourselves a true partner of integration, and what does the First Minister think the Scottish Government can do to support the third sector?
First Minister, I'll maybe turn to you first, and then we'll go to Michelle, who's on the Ministerial Strategy Group on Health.
Okay, if you don't mind, I'm going to resist the temptation to say too much about the particular pilot project because I don't know all the details of it. I'd be very happy to know more about the details. I don't even know what NHS board you're referring to, but I'd be happy to look into that. So I'll resist the temptation to get drawn into the particulars there, but try to answer your question in general terms. This is one of the challenges I think is vital for government in the lead to face up to as we go through the integration process, and for you as organisations to experience the reality of. And I was Health Secretary way back in the days when we started the integration process and we started to think through what that would look like. And from day one, we have been adamant and fought to ensure that the third sector is included as not just, as I said earlier on, add-ons or the people that the statutory sector go to when they can't find ways of doing things themselves, but as an integrated equal partner. Now, it's easy to say that. I know that achieving that in practice involves not just getting the legislation and the processes right, it also involves getting the cultures and the behaviours right, and it can often take longer to change those that have built up over a period of time. But it may be that your experience points us to what we still have to do to make sure that's a reality. But if we don't involve the third sector as an equal partner with the expertise and the experience that you bring, then integration and the potential of integration will not be as great as I believe it should be. So that will not be, and I guess this is the key point I want to make, it will not be something we can snap our fingers and achieve just by me sitting here and saying it's important, but it has to be built into that process, and we have to check as we go that it's happening in reality, not just in the rhetoric that we're using.
Michelle, do you want to pick up on how do you change the culture and behaviour point? Because I think that's probably the most important aspect of this whole agenda.
Yes, yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and you know, I think First Minister's got it in a one around about that it is a challenge, and I think, you know, the experiences that you've got with that project are repeated up and down the land with third sector organisations who are invited to come in, provide something innovative, put a lot of time and energy and volunteer effort behind it, get great results in a really short time scale, to be told, well, sorry, we've moved on and we're on to something else. And where do you go with all that learning? So, but we're also guilty as a sector of acting alone sometimes. You know, if we work together much better and we're prepared to come together more with a single voice on the agenda of integration in health and social care, we would be as big a player as the public sector is. Now, from my time in the Ministerial Strategic Group on health and social care, the difficulties that the statutory partners are having working together is big enough. And I think that's where we as a sector have a fantastic opportunity to come in and really demonstrate collectively what we contribute across Scotland, so that it's about changing the narrative, that it's not just about the medical model that they provide versus the social model that we all work to. It's about a collective model together, and that the beneficiaries of that are people, are the population. All of us have a vested interest in this. This is the care and support that we will need tomorrow, or 50, 60 years, however long, if we're lucky to live that long. So it's about us as a sector being prepared to come together more and create a much stronger single voice that says, this is not the way to get the best results. Now, they are firefighting. There is no doubt that health and social care in Scotland is under significant strain, and they are firefighting, which creates the short-termism that goes on that we experience. But to me, that's the opportunity to really provide a really strong voice, and that means much more of us working together.
Thank you, Michelle. Colleagues, anyone else got a question? Take the two ladies here. So there's just microphones just up behind you there if you want to. Oh, you want to be first? Sorry, they're just fixed this morning. Sorry about that. You say your name and your organisation.
Kate Bolsover from Realise Support and Learning Services. I just wanted to ask the First Minister, you spoke about the employability, the devolved employability, and the importance of employability programmes. But I just wonder how you reconcile that with the over 30% reduction in employability fund places for the coming year, which is going to have a big impact on people unemployed now.
Okay, thank you. Why don't we take First Minister, you want to answer? No.
What we're trying to do is make sure we've got integrated, well-aligned employability services. One of the things that I often hear from a range of different people is that our current employability services, particularly around youth employment, are very fragmented. There's lots of different programmes and projects that can be confusing and not always user-friendly for people. So what we're trying to do is align that better and make sure that we're getting, to use a phrase I hate, bangs for our bucks in terms of the impact of that, and also focusing very much on the experience that we know has worked, which is why we are such big supporters of Community Jobs Scotland, because the evidence is there that that's a programme that has helped to get and retain people in jobs. As we take responsibility for greater employability programmes, we need to make sure that we take that forward in a way that is aligned with what we're already doing. There are big, I don't want to go into this, but there are big issues around the devolution of employability services. At the moment, it looks as if they're going to devolve the power and forget to devolve any of the budget that currently goes with it, which I know nobody would believe the Westminster government would ever be quite as sneaky as that, but that looks, so we're having to think through very carefully and make a case for how that is devolved. But I think there's a huge opportunity around this to make what we do much more effective and holistic and comprehensive than it is at the moment, where it can often be quite piecemeal.
Teresa, obviously Enable are heavily involved in the employability agenda. So, your thoughts there is, how do we change that dynamic? How do we work better together as a sector to improve people's chances?
It'll be no surprise that most local authorities are doing exactly as the First Minister described there, and they're looking for more bang for their buck. that isn't always a bad thing, and I want to actually talk about a good local authority that's doing that very well. I know that might not be popular in the sector, but they sometimes get it right. Edinburgh City Council has launched, piloted and worked with Enable Scotland and 3 very small local providers to pull together, exactly as you've described, First Minister, a very fragmented employability set of programmes across the city. They've pulled it into one umbrella with Enable Scotland as a lead partner, but to be fair, that could be any one of us as a lead partner, because the principles are about not having organisational barriers to employability, but those organisations coming together and providing for Edinburgh City Council far higher levels of outcomes in terms of people into work, but more importantly for me, far higher outcomes for families in Edinburgh. And when we talk about the poverty agenda, they're taking a very holistic view. This is about getting individuals into work, but it's also about creating sustainable families in a city that clearly has an issue in terms of poverty. So again, whilst I think it's important we have the support of Scottish Government and Edinburgh City Council, the project wouldn't happen without both of those partners. The critical part has been the third sector coming together, putting aside egos, putting aside contracts, and actually saying, how do we get better outcomes for the citizens of Edinburgh? It's working very well. The research has just been published, and we're due to launch that research in the next couple of days, so look out for it. But I would urge everyone in the room to look at the experience of All in Edinburgh as a great example of exactly what you've described there.
Thank you, Teresa. To the question from the lady here.
Hello, First Minister. It's Jane Salmonson from NIDOS, the Network of International Development Organisations of Scotland. First of all, I'd like to welcome really strongly your reference early in your address today to the anti-advocacy clause, which was only announced on the 6th of February, so if anybody is behind, it is very recent. And to draw to your attention DFID, Department for International Development. I know it's a reserved matter. I'm delighted to hear that the Scottish Government won't be including this new clause in its own grant letters under its own International Development Fund. So far, so good. But as the impact on organisations and charities in Scotland who get funding through the UK aid match, for example, from DFID, it does still concern us. The 0.7% GNI, which the UK contributes to international development, comes from Scottish pockets as well as English pockets. What is actually happening is that the larger charities up here who may get UK aid match because they need a communication plan, it's their messages in the Herald, the Scotsman, the back of the bus, and so on, they can no longer speak out on behalf of the people that they serve under a DFID grant. Taking the message more widely, I wonder if the First Minister and the Scottish Government can actually, with everything else that's going on, the argument about the fiscal framework, take up this cudgel on our behalf, because from my point of view, and I represent the sector in Scotland, the international development sector in Scotland, I'm partly funded by Scottish Government, partly funded by DFID, partly funded by income raised through sale of services, membership subscriptions. Please understand that my question is funded by the Scottish Government, not DFID. If it was funded by DFID, the membership services which I provide in training, seminars, information would be cut. So it does matter, and would the First Minister be able to take this up?
First Minister.
I mean, I am acutely aware that the commitment I've given today that we will not include a clause like this in grant letters doesn't protect organisations who get funding or part funding from the UK Government who choose to do put this anti-advocacy clause in letters. So as well as giving that assurance in terms of our own grant funding, there's an obligation on the Scottish Government to argue against this happening anywhere in the UK, and I can give you a commitment that we will do this. I mean, I see this very much as fitting into a pattern of behaviour by the Westminster Government just now, which is cracking down on trade union freedoms, which is, you know, about to crack down on human rights and cracking down on the ability of third sector organisations to stand up and make their voice heard on issues that are absolutely central to the work that they do. And I think in any healthy, functioning, vibrant democracy, each and every one of these potential changes is deeply damaging and runs completely counter to the engaged and participative society that we're trying to create here in Scotland. So I wish I could tell you that I could take away the impact of it completely, and that takes us on to another bigger debate about how we should be governed. But we will continue in Scotland to do what we can ourselves to make sure that we don't go down these roads, but also use our voice to argue against what I think is an intolerant and deeply concerning direction of travel.
Okay, thank you. Colleagues, next question. I'm going to take a bunch of three. The lady here and the gentleman and the lady on the left in the middle there. So do you want to go first? Take.
I'm Mary O'Keefe, Chief Executive of Lickey House. There's three issues that I'd like to bring up. One is living wage, which we've always adopted, and it has been a struggle for a fairly new charity to do so. However, we also have an issue then. We've got to raise the other salaries within the house, so it's not just for living wage for our catering staff. We then had to increase all our salaries. Integration, we're very much part of that, and we really strongly believe it's the right thing to do, but knowing the firefighting that's going on just now, a lot of third sector is going to be there waiting for it all to happen, but being stuck in a demand-led NHS with reducing local authority budgets, and for those of us that haven't got much reserves or whatever, that is a very difficult situation to be in. And the last point, which I think it was Michelle brought up, yes, there are a lot of mergers that happen in private sector. There are not mergers that happen in the voluntary sector, and I think that is something that we should be realistic about. 5 or 6 people actually providing the same service negates a lot of our strength.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take the gentleman here as well.
Hi, good morning. David Cairns. For the past 2 years, I've worked as a volunteer on Glasgow's Poverty Leadership Panel at Glasgow City Chambers. And through that, I've worked on and contributed to Richard Lockhead's Scottish Food Commission, and to a lesser extent, Alex Neil's Short-Term Life Food Commission, which is specifically addressing emergency food provision in Scotland. 2 years ago, the provision of emergency food aid in Scotland was very different to it is today. Today, the situation is much graver, and for the next few years, I'm not expecting things to get much better fast. I work professionally in the private sector, and I was wondering what the panel and the First Minister thought of inroads for the private sector to get involved in making Scotland a more fair, just society. My experience is the private sector want to get involved with the voluntary sector, with the public sector, but occasionally, well, more than occasionally, there's barriers to prevent them getting involved. I don't think anybody in this room wants to see food banks last, well, I hope nobody in this room wants to see food banks last any longer than is necessary in Scotland. If you take away oil from Scotland, Scotland is still an abundant country. We produce more food than we can possibly consume. It doesn't make sense that we have food banks.
Thank you, Dave. Jane, we'll take this last one.
Hi, I'm Sheila Young. I'm Director of Home Start UK in Scotland. I could ask a question about local taxation because we take, in the 2,000 families we work for, the majority are referred by Health and Social Services, and we've experienced flat funding and real funding cuts over the last few years, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to say something about volunteering. We have a good track record in moving people who we've supported as parents through into volunteering and then through into employment. And across the 33 home starts in Scotland, we're beginning to look at how we can make this work better. And in that research, the feedback I'm getting is that the stress and pressure placed on people by Job Centre Plus with still very young children to get into work is actually undermining that confidence and that well-being that's growing in them through volunteering. And they are stepping away from volunteering because they can't cope with the stresses of the job search requirements that are being placed on them. Now, I know that's something that's difficult to resolve just at Scottish level, but I wanted to express how ridiculously undermining that is of those organisations that are attempting to work with the Scottish Government and others to boost volunteering, and just make the point that we're deeply undermined by those kind of developments, and that's affecting people of all age groups, not just young people.
Okay, thank you. Paul, I'll come to you first. There was two points here about volunteering. How do we get the private sector more engaged with the third sector through volunteering? And actually, there's not much we can do with the DWP and Job Centre Plus in terms of their attitudes to volunteering, but how do we maintain that confidence and increase more people volunteering?
Okay, I'll take the volunteering one first. The DWP issue is a big one for all of us. We probably deal with about 3 cases a week of young people being sanctioned for volunteering as opposed to doing job search, because a lot of advisors don't necessarily see the value of things like volunteering towards that, like many of us do in the sector. We have a job to play in that, you know, a lot of these people get it wrong and are quite junior in the DWP, and what we do is we advocate on behalf of those people and escalate that within the DWP. And sometimes you can get a bit of common sense if you go a bit higher. It's not ideal, but you know, what I would encourage everybody to do is if you've got challenges around sanctioning things like that with the DWP, that you make sure you take that up on behalf of your volunteers. 99 times out of 100 we do manage to get the issue sorted. Shouldn't be happening in the first place, but if you push, then hopefully you'll be able to get that sorted. I don't know how we get the UK government to see and recognise that volunteering is part and parcel of the whole toolbox of helping people build up the confidence to get into work. We've tried everything, but I think as things stand at the moment, I don't think they're going to change, so we just need to keep advocating on behalf of the people we work with. The private sector is an interesting one. Teresa, as well as me, has a private sector background, and I think we can do more than we do with the private sector to encourage them to get involved. I think we're quite weak sometimes as a sector in our ask, and I say that as poacher turned gamekeeper. I used to run CSR at RBS's retail bank, and I used to think one day painting fence initiatives and various things like that were great. You know, all the charities that we went and did these things with thanked us for them, this, that, and the other. Now I'm on the other side, I realise that these things are often a real pain and do nothing. I don't know how many walls were painted in the local sports centre by local corporates and various other things. So I think we need to get our ask right, because they do want to help. So I think, you know, not saying yes to what they want to do, but actually going out and talking to the private sector about what the needs are, what skills they can add to this sector, what sort of things they can do to help us and influence the way they set up their CSR programs and you know, allow people to interact and engage with the sector, particularly with things like volunteering and you know, starting to talk their language around things like personal development plans and thinking about how volunteering could be a thing that could benefit their staff and their development in the roles they have in the private sector, and trying to get time released for people to then come and contribute to the sector as something that will benefit businesses. So I think the onus is on us to go out and champion that cause, because I do think a lot of commercial organisations now want to help. They just don't know how, and they think painting fences is the way. So we need to push that agenda.
Thank you, Paul. First Minister, there was a number of points here. There was food poverty in effect, there was the living wage, and I suppose there was mergers and acquisitions in the sector. I'm sure you don't want to have a view on that.
I was going to start by saying I've got a fence at home that if anybody wants to come and paint, they'd be very, very welcome. Some really good and actually very interrelated points raised there. I'll try and run through most of the key ones as quickly as possible. Mary, your points about the living wage I think are very well made. Lots of organisations in the third sector have strived to pay the living wage, and that's been difficult, challenging. You make a good point about differentials, which increase the scale of the challenge. My view, and this has driven some of our decision making in the last few months, is that we really need to, there's about 81% of all workers in Scotland across all sectors are now paid the living wage, but the 19% that aren't are concentrated in a number of sectors, you know, tourism, retail, catering and social care. And social care, I guess, is the one that we've got most influence over as government. So if we're going to really make a big step change in the living wage, we've got to focus on the sectors where it's still an issue. And that's been central to our discussions with local authorities and the local authority settlement for the next financial year, which all local authorities have now signed up to, and we now go into some very detailed work that will be needed to make sure that the extra money that we've provided translates into payment of the living wage to all social care workers. We could have said we wanted that to happen by the 1st of April. It would have been great to have it happen by the 1st of April, but we recognise some of the practical issues that have to be dealt with, which is why we've set the date of the 1st of October for that to be implemented. Your wider point about firefighting and demand-led NHS, that for me is what underpins all of what we're trying to do around health and social care. Now, I should say, to start with, the very nature of health and social care means that you will always have a degree of firefighting and you will always have a degree of demand-led services. That's in the nature of providing health and social care. But we need to make it less like that. And integration, I guess, it's the process to describe a much more fundamental change in our model of healthcare. I mean, I said before, I was health secretary for a number of years. You could pour money into the health service year after year after year, and almost regardless of how much money you put into it, if that's all you do, the health service will continue to be firefighting and run into standstill. Such are the challenges that it faces. So we've got to fundamentally change how we deliver things. So it's not just about integration as a process, it's about the transfer of resources, which we've started with the £250 million transfer this year, and that has to accelerate so that we're providing more care preventively, we're providing more care in communities, in people's own homes, in institutions like your own, and enabling the NHS to be less of the firefighting organisation that it is. Your last point about mergers, that's probably one for the sector, but I would say, I think Teresa raised a very good point earlier on, and it's a point that goes way beyond the third sector. We're a country of 5 million people, and I think increasingly we will have to ask tough questions, as we've done over the last few years about our police and our fire services. Increasingly we have to ask those questions about our local authorities, our health boards, our third sector organisations. Is the way in which we organise ourselves right for the circumstances we live in? And that can be difficult, but it actually is more difficult long term if you don't ask and answer these questions. David, I think you raised very good questions about, well, firstly, your disgust is shared by me and by the government about food poverty in this country. It's appalling that in a country as rich as Scotland, we have food poverty. Much of that is being caused by welfare changes and sanctions and all the rest of it. We are providing support to the emergency food sector and will continue to do that. The private sector does have a role to play. We're trying through things like the Scottish Business Pledge to encourage the private sector to understand that the decisions they take and how they run their businesses have a direct impact on the fairness of the society we live in. But in turn, the fairness of the society we live in has a direct impact on the success of their businesses. It's a mutually supporting thing. And I think Paul's very right to talk about the third sector and society as a whole being much more clear about what we're asking the private sector to do. Not all private companies, but many of them do want to be involved. So it's about getting that partnership working effectively as well. Scottish Business in the Community actually does very good work at trying to engage with the private sector in that as well. And lastly, Sheena, I know you didn't ask me about local tax, but we're going into an election where that will be a big issue. We've just had our Commission on Local Tax reporting, so there are big questions for all parties about how we reform local taxation and make it more sustainable in the future. And my party's certainly thinking very hard about some of these questions at the moment. But your main point, which has also been touched on about DWP, what do we do about DWP? I could be here all day, no doubt ranting if I got too deeply into that question. I think none of what I'm going to say here is a reflection on the staff who work in job centres who are doing a very, very difficult job to the best of their abilities. But the environment that's been created for them to work in is impossible. Because let's be honest about it, it's not about helping individuals, It's about numbers, it's about budgets, it's about getting people off benefits, and that is what drives the whole system, not about how we support people and how we support people into work. And until we change that whole culture, until we get rid of the abomination that is the sanctions regime, we're not going to deal with the issues of DWP. And I make no apology for saying that one of the things we've got to do is wrest as much of it out of the hands of the DWP as we possibly can and get it into the hands of our own Parliament, where it's not a recipe for never having any difficulties, but at least we could be sure that we're trying to achieve the right things with it.
First Minister, thank you very much. Colleagues, as always, time has run away with us, so can you show your appreciation to the panel in the kind of usual manner? Before I invite the First Minister up to make some final concluding remarks, she touched earlier on the public trust and confidence in charities that SCVO published this morning. I would definitely recommend that you all have a look. I mean, the figures for involvement of the public, the trust and confidence in the sector are extremely high. The figures are absolutely astounding. And I think that's a tribute to everybody in this room and all the charities and voluntary organisations throughout the country, and the people who give up so much time to raise money. So definitely be commended and for use with you. And I'm going to ask the First Minister to come up and make some final remarks.
Once I've finished pouring Teresa's water.
Yeah.
I'll be very brief in conclusion. I think the questions that we've just had there and the discussions that have flowed from those questions, I think encapsulated very well some of the significant challenges that we face, how we deal with an ageing population. And the first thing we should do is stop talking about the ageing population as a burden. It's actually a fantastic thing, but how we organise ourselves, our health, our social care, our society as a whole to deal with that is one of the big challenges we face. How we structure ourselves, whether in the statutory sector or the third sector, to deal with a time in which we know money is tight and will continue to be tight, but we've got these big challenges to face up to is hugely important. And we've touched on some of that today, and how we work together. I mean, I've always known this, but as in the last 15 months or so since I've been First Minister, it's become more acutely obvious to me that government can't do it alone, you guys can't do it alone, the private sector, the statutory sector, in any country, but particularly in a country as small as Scotland. It's the relationships and the way we work together that will determine our ability to face up to these challenges, and your role in this is absolutely crucial, which is why the main thing I want to say today is just to underline that recognition on the part of me and the government of the importance of the role you perform, and about us enabling and facilitating you to perform that role even better across a whole range of different ways, rather than trying to get in the way of that and make your life more difficult. So I stand here as the First Minister offering to work in partnership, knowing there will be disagreements and tensions and issues we have to deal with, but believing passionately that if we come together and try to deal with these things in that spirit of partnership, then we can achieve a great deal. So thank you very much to you and to everybody you work with for the incredible work you do to help make our country a better place to live.